Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see you. Thanks very much for coming. I'm Michael Wakelin, and this is the Religion Media Centre's annual lecture 2022. So we're hugely indebted to the Reverend Alison Joyce, to James Irving, and to Nadira Wallace, and the team here at St Bride's for hosting us so graciously. We're very grateful. And also to Michael Sternberg, KC, or QC as he was when he first wrote to me, and the Sir Sigmund Sternberg Charitable Foundation for financially supporting this event. The Religion Media Centre has been blessed with several funders, though we could always do with more, who have enabled us to achieve at least some of our ambitions over the last 4 years, increasing our impact not just with the amount of original content we produce, but also the range of activities that we perform. Our aim, we remind ourselves regularly, is to help the media report and reflect on religion. We are not affiliated to any faith. We are strictly non-confessional. We simply think that religion matters and should be properly understood, and that its coverage demands the highest editorial standards. It was interesting to see that we are in good company, with our new King Charles assembling faith leaders in one of his first audiences to explain that he thinks of Britain as a community of communities, and his duty is to serve in a way that reflects the world in which we now live and to protect the diversity of our country. Allow me just 90 seconds to highlight some of the Religion Media Centre's work. Our Five Cities project in Leeds, Nottingham, Plymouth, Birmingham and Manchester, bringing together religious communities with media editors and reporters, has been one of our most successful. Realising the two sides were not talking to each other, we made the connections, and 97% of our participants told us that it had worked. Funding has been secured for another 5 cities for the next year, and more cities keep knocking on our doors wanting us to visit them. We've continued to grow our overall audience, now reaching an estimated 75,000 over the last year through all our social media outlets. If you haven't done so already, do follow us on Twitter or our LinkedIn and our YouTube channel. Thousands visit our website, accessing our excellent and authoritative fact sheets. Our weekly online briefings put up on YouTube can attract tens of thousands of views across the world. And hundreds enjoy our daily news bulletins, providing a helpful digest of the religious news from around the world and offering hints for journalists looking for stories. Starting in January this year, we introduced our monthly Religion Media Centre podcast. And from this September, we've made this weekly in order to cover stories more promptly. We also staged our annual festival at JW3, the Jewish Cultural Centre, and have delivered training on reporting religion for Reach PLC and media training for senior faith leaders. Our new website celebrates its first year of operation and is largely responsible for engaging with so many people, and so many people here. If you haven't found it yet, it's religionmediacentre.org.uk, and if you haven't signed up for our daily news bulletins, you should be ashamed of yourselves. I am ridiculously proud of these achievements. Ridiculous, not just because I think they are amazing, which they are, considering 4 years ago no one had even heard of us, but also ridiculous that I should be so proud of them because all the work has been done by others. I simply sit back and admire our team of excellent journalists who work so hard and deliver so well. Many of you are here this evening, and thanks for coming. I admire our stable of academic friends who contribute to our thoroughbred bank of fact sheets enjoyed by so many around the world. Our dedicated trustees and advisors who keep us on track, and again, they're here to engage with you afterwards. But most especially, the genius and expertise of Ollie Bowring and his team, and Sorcha Connell, and the extraordinary superhuman contribution of Ruth Peacock to the success of the Religion Media Centre. I want to thank them all here and now. And of course, all of you for coming to our lecture this evening. I believe and know we're in for a treat. There'll be time for Q&A afterwards, so do please make notes and think of ways of continuing the conversation. And at the end, there'll be refreshments at the back of the church. When we invited our distinguished guest to deliver a lecture on the theme of the future of religion in Britain, we knew it would be topical, but could not have imagined that it would be so incredibly apposite. With a census about to be published, which no doubt will have eye-catching stats about the religiosity of the nation, having just witnessed the most extraordinary outburst of popular spirituality ever seen on these shores, fresh from mourning the loss of an adored queen whose Christian faith has been heralded in every commentary I've heard or seen on the telly, and an incoming king who has solidly declared himself a devout Christian, member of the Church of England, and defender of the faith, I think the nation is in for a fascinating spiritual journey over the next few years. And here to shed light on the way ahead is an internationally renowned sociologist and theologian, one of the world's leading experts in the field, the F.D. Maurice Professor and Head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College London. Please, will you warmly welcome Linda Woodhead.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Alison and the team for such a lovely space to be in. And thank you all for coming. It's a real honor to be able to address you and then have some discussion afterwards. I'm going to speak for 45 minutes and then we've got half an hour for your probing questions. Considering the Future of Religion is my title. And as Michael says, since I agreed to speak on this, one thing we thought would happen hasn't happened, and that's the publication of the census results. And another thing we didn't expect, the death of the Queen, has happened. The death of the Queen isn't my theme, but I'm going to refer to it now and again. And actually, I don't think it's going to make a difference to Christianity or the churches, and I'll explain why. As to the census results, my purpose was never really to talk about them. It's more to put them in context, to tell the bigger story. Just to remind you, though, about those figures, they're already starting to show a trend. The census question on religion was first asked in 2001. And the three big trends that have come out and that I expect to continue are, firstly, a fall in those identifying as Christian. In England and Wales, from 72% in the first census, 2001, with religion, to 59% in 2011. Secondly, a steady rise in the number identifying as none, as having no religion. In England and Wales, from 15% in 2001 to 25% in 2011. Will that go up to a third or so? And then thirdly, a steady rise in the number of those identifying as Muslim, from 3% in 2001 to 5% in 2011, and expected to continue to rise. What will it be? We'll see, 8%, maybe. From numbers to events, on Sunday, September the 4th, evening prayer was said at Clonliffe College, Dublin, for the last time. That is one of those enormous powerhouses of the Catholic Church, of the Irish Catholic Church, that together with Maynooth and All Hallows, educated clergy to man a global religious empire for about a century. Its closure, though, has been an event of no wider cultural significance whatsoever. Now, I'm not going to be talking about Ireland or Northern Ireland. I'm going to confine myself to Great Britain in a small sense, England, Scotland, and Wales. But Ireland, the Catholic Church, is a very important part of the bigger picture, and I will refer back to the significance of its collapse. I'm going to give you 4 predictions, my predictions, when I consider the future of religion in the coming decades. But before doing that, I went back to look at other people's predictions. And the book I particularly reread was a book that came out when I started my academic career. It's called 2020 Visions, The Futures of Christianity in Britain. And it came out in 1992. And actually, they weren't just looking forward to 2020, they were looking forward 30 years. So they were looking forward to today, exactly today. This is exactly 30 years ago. So it was very interesting to read that and see how their predictions have held up. To my surprise, really very well. And I'm going to read you a few of the things that people got really very right. And there was more very right than very wrong. First of all, the late Adrian Hastings, a very distinguished church historian and a Catholic. He focuses on Roman Catholicism, and he says, Rome has not got thinking Catholics on its side anywhere in the world. This is 1992. And he sees that intellectual failure as quite fatal for the future that he is looking towards anyway. He goes on, British Catholic intellectual life has moved into universities where it is free from church control. While not at present divorced from the institutional church, it could well become so. It's hard to be optimistic about the Catholic Church in the coming years, but unless one can be a little optimistic, one can only be deeply pessimistic about the general vitality and effectiveness of British Christianity as a whole over the next generation. And then he goes on to single out the big intellectual failures of the churches, and particularly the Catholic Church. And one of the most important things he points out is its failure to deal seriously with Islam. He says by 2020, Britain will be far more of an Islamic country than most of us can contemplate. At the same time, world Islam will be more active and expansive, maybe more bruised. In several parts of the world, there could be open Christian-Muslim conflict. If the coming decades have a quite particular character in church history, it may be because for the first time in centuries, the relationship with Islam becomes the primary and dominating issue. Most Christians, even bishops and theologians, are woefully ignorant of Islam. I think he got that pretty right. The second person who got something right was the late Andrew Walker, who was at King's, and he was particularly interested in the house churches and the growth of the house churches. And at that time, if you think back to the 90s, the house church, small, intimate churches, often with a charismatic tinge, actually housed in people's houses, were burgeoning. And a lot of people, particularly within the movement, were very optimistic this was going to take over and grow and grow. And so he's thinking about that. And he says, sects do not typically conform to the world, they seek to conform the world to themselves. In practice, this means the creation of a bulwark against plurality. This can either lead to inward-looking preservation societies in which others are excluded, or it can lead to an aggressive recruitment agency in which the sect competes with other cultural agencies for personnel. Christians usually call this evangelism. And his prediction is that it will go in the latter way. And we're going to see, and I'm quoting him now again, sectarian expansion not just at the expense of historic institutions. To be more exact, he says, historic church institutions will grow so far as they choose to behave in a manner usually associated with evangelistic sects. I'm going to say that's exactly what happened. And then he ends pessimistically. He thinks this will be bad for the future of Christianity. I agree. And he says, the problem is that this kind of Christianity, I quote, preaches against the spirit of the age, out of the spirit of the age. It stands up for orthodoxy, but in the rags of modernism. Third person who got it right, Haddon Wilmer, who I think was a Baptist, if I can remember right. And he makes an important point about denominational capture of Christianity. He says, before 2020, we will see the passing away of the remnants of the last generation in Britain who were Christian because they were brought up that way and because being Christian was respectable normality. He saw that coming very quickly. Education will not do much for the future of Christianity. More has been expected from schools than they can deliver. And so the future will rest more increasingly on choice, and that means adult choice. So the future of the churches, he predicts, will depend on their ability to have adults choose for them, not through normal, customary passing on through families. And then his point about denominational capture. He says, after 2020, I think it likely that the main denominations, as we know them, will still manage most of the shelf space in the Christian section of the religious supermarket. This prospect causes me to swing between regret and gratitude. On balance, regret. And how right he has been. You know, part of what he talks about as well is the failure to engage the laity and denominational capture involving clerical capture. Finally, and the most striking of all the essays in this book, which is, after all, about the futures of Christianity, finally, Kim Knott, who I'm privileged was my colleague at Lancaster University for quite a while. Kim Knott writes an essay that really stands out because she talks about other perspectives and different voices. And she sees how the Christian voice will become a recessive voice, and other religious and ethnic voices will start, different points of view that are not now current, will be heard, she says. These are not Christian points of view. She quotes a poem from an Indian woman. What white woman? You say, I am who? Your sister. You have a picture of me. You've come to help. Why? When? How? Here? The picture, white woman, let me see it. I remember no picture I gave you. You have made a picture of me all by yourself. Now hear me speak. In my own voice, get off my back. And Kim Knott points to the increase in the incidence of such voices. The Satanic Verses controversy, very live, of course, that was 1988. Increasing number of Muslims speaking out, Jews speaking out, defending positions on ritual slaughter. Muslims putting the case for separate Muslim schools. Sikhs speaking for and against Khalistan. Hindus and Muslims for and against the siting of the temple to Rama at Ayodhya. In 30 years from now, she says, there are likely to be more such voices in evidence than now. They will have their own ways of dealing with the future, probably a complex mixture of conservatism, an element of all religions, and movements for change, adaptation, and response to current circumstances, both in Britain and other relevant international locations. Questions of leadership, sectarian development, the roles of women, young and old, relations with places of origin and their institutions, vernacular and sacred languages, educational and legal considerations will all be important matters. Absolutely spot on. And I'm going to say a bit more about that, but well done, Kim Knott. I think I give Kim Knott the prize in that one. So predicting isn't just a mug's game. I mean, it is surprising how you can see some things by extrapolating, not just from trends, but to having a really good ear like Kim Knott, who was one of the very first people doing research amongst those communities, listening to the weak signals and amplifying it. That's just as important as well. So, to my 4 trends and predictions. 2 foreseen here and 2 not so much. But first, let me sort of take a step back and explain my theoretical underpinnings. The way I'm judging these things in terms of what I think are the ingredients of vitality in religion. And I have managed to boil them down to 5 and an acronym so you can remember. And the acronym, it's not really a word, it's MICES. Mice, plural, mices. Sorry, I couldn't do better. And so the 5 ingredients of vitality, so we can look at things and see whether they might grow or decline. The 5 ingredients are metaphysics, to be an M, the intellectual life, what Adrian Hastings is talking about, cognitive credibility, the metaphysical. Secondly, the institutionalized. And I don't just mean big institutions with power and money. I mean custom and practice. The fact that we've always done it like this. Back to the Queen's funeral. Did that show that suddenly there's an enormous sense of legitimacy of the church? No, it's just that we've always done it like that. It's the norm. It's not difficult. It's the way we do those things. It's the way that death of royal family is marked. That's institutionalized ceremony. That's what I mean by institutionalized. Thirdly, community, giving people a sense of actually belonging and therefore of identity, MIC. 4th, E, ethics and values. And 5thly, spirituality, actual living contact with the sacred, with God, with gods. You need some of those, and the more the better, if you're going to be successful religiously. So my first trend and prediction, my title for it is Fundamentalism, Winning the Battle but Losing the War. Fundamentalism, winning the battle but losing the war. Fundamentalism has had a fantastic 30 years, maybe 60 years, in all the world religions. And close to home, in virtually all the churches in Britain, including the largest, the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, the Church in Wales, and the Roman Catholic Church. Fundamentalism is what it says on the label, boiling religion down to the fundamentals. And it has this quality of loving factiness. It likes to make everything facty in a sort of modern scientific sense, empirical, the actual bodily resurrection, you can touch it, the plain facts. These are banners as well that you can proclaim, and fundamentalism develops absolutely hand in hand with advertising at the start of the 21st century. It literally, Christian fundamentalism was trying to boil it down so that it could be pushed through the mass media, that new channel. And the factiness isn't just confessions of faith, doctrinal statement, it's also morals. There's a moral puritanism about fundamentalism, and it wants to say, this is the only way that you can live your life. And so it's inherently exclusivistic. We've got the facts, we've got the truth, you haven't. The best title for a religious book I ever heard was by a Christian fundamentalist. His book was just called These Are the Facts, which really sums it up. That has captured the churches, including in this country, even though they never use the word fundamentalist. And weirdly, it's captured the media, the general imagination of discussion around religion. So I cannot tell you the number of times that I've been interviewed about religion and talked about versions of Christianity that are not fundamentalist, and the interviewer says, yes, but that's wishy-washy, that's liberal, it's not real religion. The interviewer has absolutely no sympathy with fundamentalism whatsoever, but somehow in their mind that is real religion. And if you don't subscribe to that facty religion, you're not really religious, you're somehow a bit of a weak version of it. So fundamentalism has won in that sense. Even in the Catholic Church, maybe we can go back to, well, I'm going to take it back to Pope John Paul II, who was a moral theologian, and his campaigns around about the family. I mean, a real turnaround for the Catholic Church, which had defended celibacy, but it becomes the great defender of the traditional family and the traditional gender roles within it, and anti-gay. Now, on its own, if you look at the Mises, this isn't necessarily very strong. It never captures more than a very small number. It was leavened and made much more palatable in this country, as elsewhere in the world, by charisma. It was a combination of the fundamentalist package with the Holy Spirit, with charisma, with the real, that gave it the spirituality. Otherwise, it's just dry, biblical, not very appealing. But you had a clear kind of moral and intellectual message, and you had this very, very exciting, deeply felt, very important, and deeply meaningful to people, experience directly of God in Christ and the Holy Spirit. It was the combination that really triumphed in the Catholic as well as the Protestant churches. But it hasn't won the war. It hasn't stopped the relentless decline of Christianity every single year in the statistics by a single percentage point. There's no up and down in that decline, it's just steady. Probably for a century. We've only got statistics that go back less than that, but probably just steady decline. It's not made, even though it felt from the inside this was a massive revival, it wasn't really. Not enough to change that overall decline. And it was counterproductive, I think, for the whole, because it turned religion into what I've called somewhere a toxic brand, something that you're embarrassed to say you're religious in case people think that you're a fundamentalist too. Matthew Guest, Christian owner, Sonia Sharma, Rob Warner wrote a book in 2013 called Christianity and the University Experience, and they did a huge amount of research on a number of university campuses with students. It's the best study we've got of what they think about Christianity. They found, Matthew Guest calls it silent Christianity, a lot more people identifying as Christian than you might think amongst students, but they would never tell anybody. The Christian Union being the prominent face, a fundamentalist face, on campuses, and people either being put off by that or not wanting to own up to their own faith in case they were identified with it. So that kind of counterproductiveness of the great evangelical rallies that probably put more people off this faith than ever won for it. So I don't think, the battle has been lost. So I think continued Christian decline. If you look at the Mises, the metaphysical fail. Fundamentalism has arrested the intellectual development of Christianity and the huge challenges it had to face. It hasn't been able to. Institutionalized, well, to some extent, yes, the Queen's funeral. It's still somewhat institutionalized, but it gets weaker and weaker. Less and less are young people brought up with this as familiar custom to them. Community, yes. Christian churches can still provide very strong sense of community for those within them. Ethics and values, yes, if you want a very clear moral teaching. Spiritual experience, yes, in the charismatics. So it ticks some of the Mises, but it's got those really fundamental intellectual problems and the decreasing institutional customary, just because we do it, which kept it alive for so long. That's going quickly. So secondly, that my first one was fundamentalism winning the battle but losing the war. My second one is Muslims finding their place, or Islam finding its place. And the fact that I can't decide which of those titles is quite telling, I think. Is British Islam going to be a unified thing? Probably not. That's why I say Muslims, because it's diversifying. And I want to thank my new colleague at King's, Dr. Alia Ebery, who's sitting on the front row in case there are any difficult questions, who's helped me think this through for this lecture, and my colleague from Lancaster, Dr. Sharouk Naguib. Great anthropologists and Islamic scholars. We need to do a little tiny bit of history here. If you read histories of Muslims in Britain, they often are at such pains to tell you that Muslims have been here for centuries that it gives a false impression. The reality is that Islam and Muslims haven't been a really visible presence until the 70s, maybe even later. And they came in large numbers for post-war reconstruction, and they came with no home except the ones they would have to go on to build. No cultural or religious home, almost no Muslim infrastructure. Today's British Muslims are 75% South Asian origin, particularly Indian subcontinent, mostly from the two poorest parts, from Mirpur and Punjab in Pakistan and Sylhet in Bangladesh, also some from Gujarat. These were areas where there was imperial mismanagement. The kind of consolation prize was to be given passage here to work in industries that quite quickly declined. And the majority who came were working class, usually with rural backgrounds. And these three groups, Punjabi, Bangladeshi, Gujarati, have tended to remain in sheltering enclaves and mainly to marry within them. South Asian Muslims and British Muslims, by extension, 75%, are conservative about religion. Religiously, culturally, morally, the most conservative of all Anglophone Muslim communities. And unlike earlier waves of migrants into this country, many have never had to break links to the homeland. Some people call that postmodern migration. You don't have to break the link because of improved communications, both physical and virtual. And marriage is transacted across the boundary. But now we're in a third generation. First generation had to struggle to just get basic needs, to cater for basic needs and build basic infrastructure, madrasas, mosques, halal butchers, supplementary schools, all this. Second generation had to fight civil rights battles, girls in schools fighting to wear hijab. The Rushdie affair in '88, Muslim voices being raised against that. Genocide in Bosnia in the 90s had a galvanizing effect on British Muslim political presence. And so in this second generation, you got the setting up of civil society organizations, some of which have been very successful, like Islamic Relief, but also parliaments to speak on behalf of Muslims, and things like the Muslim Council of Britain. Lots have come and gone, some are still around, but changed. Third generation. Many now have never visited the country of origin and know nothing but life in the UK. Far more young Muslims have gone through higher education, even though no history of that in the family. There's more ethnic mixing in different Muslim communities. Mosques slowly adapting. And, this is really interesting, the establishment of new cultural kinds of British Islam. And here, things like food, clothing, music, and cities, very creative places. There's much more ethnic diversity amongst Muslims. Cities like Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Cardiff, Glasgow, and Edinburgh. And there are lots of subcultures, and the digital makes that much more possible. But what's interesting is that religion is central. Islam is central to emerging youth identities, and it is still cool, unlike Christianity. British Muslim cultural output is cool around the world. There are new genres like nasheed, devotional songs. If you look them up on YouTube, you'll see 10 million hits for some of these songs. And of course, we're seeing prominent Muslims in politics now, including the London mayor, and other signs of finding a place. This, I think, will continue. British Islam is getting a global profile, and young Muslims are very important in that. But there is still the disconnect and tension between the conservative groups, the less outward-looking communities, and the more ethnically mixed and creative. Islam unites them both, but different versions of it. So why do I think it's going to continue? Because the interesting thing to compare Islam in Britain in terms of the future with is what happened to Roman Catholicism in Britain. You remember that Catholics set up very good schools. Catholics in England and Scotland and Wales wanted to propel their children into the middle classes through education. So very good schooling, very successfully turned Catholics, moved their class upwards and turned them into successful professionals and so on. But it didn't, the idea was this will benefit the church because we'll have Catholics in positions of influence across society. It didn't really work because they tended to leave behind their faith. So if you compare Islam, you could say, well, that's going to happen now. As more and more are educated, the same thing will happen. They will turn from their faith and become secular. Well, some will, of course. But somehow Catholicism didn't manage to remain cool, whereas Islam is, and cool means being culturally vital and generative as well. And if we go through the mices, metaphysics, is it strong intellectually? I'll come back to that, because I think that's a maybe. Let me look at things that are really strong. Spirituality, very strong. Deep devotion, very important to many young Muslims and older Muslims. Ethics, yes, strong. They may be a bit unbending, are those, but of enormous ethical interest, an interest in the law as well as ethics. Community and identity, very strong. Institutionalized elements, very strong. There's cradle to grave for Islamic provision. And Islam is very successful at passing on the faith in families. So going back to the metaphysical, the final M of the mice, is it going to keep intellectually healthy? We saw Adrian Hastings saying that was very fatal has been fatal to the churches, that they didn't keep intellectually vibrant. Will Islam keep intellectually vibrant? That's probably the key question, I think. The face of Islamic studies in UK universities is changing quickly because there are many very able Muslims in postgrad and research work. There are certain people like Tim Winter, or as he's called, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, and the Cambridge Muslim College, motivating young scholars to really study metaphysics and theology, and not just the law, not just Islamic law, which has tended to capture it. Will that succeed? That's a really important question for the future, I think. Thirdly, my third thing, not predicted at all in this book, I've called my third heading is Magic and the Decline of Religion. And it's a riff, some of you will notice, on a book that Keith Thomas published, the historian Keith Thomas, in 1971, a book that went on to become very famous called Religion and the Decline of Magic. That was influential because Thomas turned to popular as well as high culture, and he took seriously very neglected topics such as fairy beliefs, ghosts, omens, popular prophecies, village healers, wise women. That's been very influential to look at those kinds of sources in history and anthropology, of course. But the central theme was a conventional one. Thomas took Max Weber's idea that modernization means disenchantment, rationalization and secularization. Thomas took that on board. His little twist was that he argued that actually it wasn't science that was causing the decline of magic, the disenchantment. It was religion. Religion became more sort of rationalized and crusading and pushed that out. Well, I want to say that actually the exact opposite has happened, that religion is declining, with the possible exception of Islam in this country, but magic is flourishing. To put it very vividly, more of my students and Gen Z as a whole are actively interested in astrology and tarot than in organized religion, but though they now access it on apps on their phone. And those who want to go deeper into it intellectually read widely, they listen to podcasts, they go to festivals, they might join a pagan group or a Wiccan group or whatever. Now, I am not talking about everyone, and I'm not predicting that this is going to capture everyone by any means. I'm not even necessarily saying this has really grown. I suspect this has always been there. Always been there in every society, in every age, probably about the same amount, but sometimes you just can't tell people. And now you can. It's lost its stigma. Surveys, including my own, regularly show about 1 in 5 of the population believing in or practicing some activity that you could classify as magical. Things that religions, institutional religions, are ambivalent about. Things to do with ghosts, the dead, angels, fate and destiny, luck, fortune-telling, astrology. And things that slide between magic and religion, particularly healing, faith healing, spiritual healing, and belief in afterlife and souls. All this is still visible, is still important, is more talked about than it was when I was young. And as I say, paganism has grown and diversified and created lots of different subcultures, both right-wing and left-wing, and it's vital and many young people are involved. And there's creative invention. And interestingly, it's starting, it's crept into the wider culture. So words like chi or spirit, energy, this is all in the wider culture. And if you go to any graveyard, you won't see nearly as many Christian symbols, except angels, who are popular again in a new way. And you will see, well, they are Christian symbols, but quite recessive ones. Butterflies everywhere now, symbolizing, the chrysalis, the death, and then the life taking a new form. Windmills, those little windmills, so the spirit can catch it. Dream catchers hanging in trees. We've stopped talking about death suddenly, and we've taken the spiritualist word passing. Someone passed rather than someone died. These subtle changes in the wider culture, taking it out of that sort of occult world into the mainstream. I'll just give you one figure. In 2021, towards the end of the pandemic, I did a national survey, and one of my questions was, this is partly because of the pandemic, do you think it is or is not possible for those who have died, passed, to make contact with the living? Do you think it's possible for the dead to make contact with the living? That's my question. Not possible, 48%. Possible, 23%. Don't know, 29%. And that's a pretty typical result when you ask about these sorts of questions. Just under half, quite clear, no. The rest divided between, yes, I know that's true and I've had that experience, or agnostic. I just don't know. That's similar to belief in God as well, by the way. So, why do I think it's going to continue? I have to go through my mices to tell you why I think it's going to continue to be vital. Metaphysically, it's very strong. It's often ridiculed as superficial and shallow. Not a bit of it. It's got, for those who go deeper, it's much better at dealing with evolution and science and cosmology, which is bread and butter to it. That there are these massive cycles of life and growth and rebirth and death, and that everything is recycled, and that everything is energy. And everyone says, well, science is showing this now. We've always known this was true. And that the planet is Gaia. These ideas come out of alternative spirituality, and they go into the mainstream, so it's not intellectually stupid and shallow. It's metaphysically exciting for people. Institutionalized, well, as I said, it's becoming much more institutionalized, much more mainstream. Does it provide community? Yes, for those who want it. Most are still solitary practitioners. Does it provide ethics? No, not really. It's very close to the culture in its ethics. Does it provide spirituality? Absolutely, yes. So it's strong, it's pretty strong. I don't see a really weak spot. Finally, and I'm about to wrap up, but finally and fourthly, my fourth heading is the fire sale of the churches, the fire sale, and the growth of non-religion. The predictors in this book also failed to predict this, the growth in those who say they have no religion. Well, you can forgive them because saying you have no religion is an artifact of the census and it didn't exist in 1992, so not entirely their fault. And after all, no religion is just, a survey and census label. What's more interesting is the bigger picture behind that label. And I want to sum it up with the image of a fire sale of the cultural property of the churches. We forget that historically and around the world, it's quite unusual for a religion to be what the historian Peter Brown calls a compact constellation of commitments. That's what he called Christianity when he was saying, looking at its early growth. It packaged rituals, values, beliefs, practices, community. You've got your whole thing in one package. Well, that has all come apart. And there's been a fire sale, and different providers have bought parts of the old Christian package and are being the providers of it. Education and knowledge is an obvious example. But the example I'm currently fascinated by is values. The churches have failed so dramatically as moral authorities, with the abuse scandals being just the latest nail in that coffin, that there is currently a free-for-all in the area of values leadership. So every school, business, university, institution publishes its value statements and has long consultations about them and then tries to embody and enforce them with varying degrees of success. And governments since late New Labour insist on teaching fundamental British values in schools. The Queen did an excellent job of becoming a values leader, of much greater stature than any Christian leader in the country, and I think she knew that. Just one example of the fire sale. But in other words, the growth of non-religion is a sign that organised religions, especially the churches, have lost their grip over more and more and more areas of territory that were once theirs. It's not that the things that religion used to do have just disappeared in a puff of smoke, but other providers do them under all sorts of labels, generally not religious. And insofar as they have greater legitimacy than the churches and more buy-in, and so long as they do an okay job and don't turn hypocrite as well, there's no reason to think that's going to stop or the churches will ever get their old jobs back. I'm going to conclude not by summing all that up, because I hope it was clear enough for you to remember the main lines of my argument, but I just want to conclude with, this is something for which I have really very little evidence, and therefore I hold it very deeply and firmly. And the more I've studied religion, the more I think this is true, and I will never be able to prove it. I'll call it the Woodhead thesis. My thesis is that about 1 in 5, about 20% of people in any generation, in any era, in any society other than where there's religious repression, are devoutly interested, engaged in religion, magic, or spirituality. And it doesn't ever really change. So what we study in censuses and society, that is the social, that's the social acceptability and profile of different kinds of religion, which changes in fascinating ways as society and culture change. But if you think about people who are really deeply, devoutly, it really matters to them. I think they were always a minority, and I think they will always continue to be a minority. So I have a kind of constant view of that, but don't ask me to prove it. It's just a hunch. Thank you very much for your attention. I've finished on time, so we've got time for questions.
Great, thanks very much, Linda. Time for questions. I imagine there'll be quite a few. I hope there will be, certainly. And I might can you manage three in a row, as it were, if there's lots of questions? You can, okay. Let's see, how many hands would like to ask? So, yeah, and Jonathan back there. Okay, well, you three first, and then we'll carry on. Oh, there we are. Okay, can I just say you must wait for the microphone to come to you, otherwise we can't record it.
Thank you very much indeed, Linda. Picking up your point about winning the battle but losing the war, I think it was Steve Bruce who made the very interesting observation that some of the mega churches, the kind of fundamentalist mega churches, are characterized by being stripped of any identity that is religious at all. Hillsong being a good example that he cites. You wouldn't know from the name Hillsong that it was anything to do with religion. That could be a sauna or a wine bar. This church meets in a gymnasium or a school hall, so it has no kind of spirituality of place. Its leaders are called Dave and Mick, and they wear sweatshirts. There's no kind of... So part of my question is, do you think he's correct that that's actually, ironically, hastening the process of secularization because it's so presenting itself as secular? And is that part of the kind of factiness that you were describing? But secondly, the church decides where it's going to put its resources, and increasingly it's looking to put its resources in places that it regards as successful, and it looks to the kinds of churches you've been describing. Oh, look, they're pulling in the young people. Is that a catastrophic mistake, and where should the church be putting its resources?
I think this strategy of trying to get very, very close to the culture so you're invisible as religious, so you'll pull people in without them really quite knowing what it is, has actually been going on for quite a long time. The Methodist Church tried it when it built Methodist Central Hall, that huge building, and lots of other ones in every city in Britain that tried to look like a shopping centre or a hall or not a church and have cafes in. They tried all the mega-church things. Christianity never learns from its mistakes. So they tried the mega-church thing. It completely didn't work because people said, well, I didn't realise it was a church. It doesn't look like a church. I think that strategy is, I suppose it's a really bad attempt to come to terms with the church's previous failure, because the previous failure made Christianity very uncool, so young people didn't want anything to do with it. And so they thought, well, let's hide the fact that it is religion at all. But it's a pretty counterproductive strategy, really, or it can be hypocritical. And once you realise you've been reeled in and then given a hard sell, that can be really distasteful as well. So I think it has demonstrably not really succeeded. But maybe there was nothing else it could do, having already queered its own pitch so much.
Thank you. And Jonathan?
Jonathan Romain. I'm a rabbi, but very interested in the critique of Christianity that you gave. Firstly, why has it declined? I mean, you mentioned the fire sale of things like...
You have to talk very slowly because of the echo.
Oh, right. Why has Christianity declined? I mean, you mentioned some aspects, like the fire sale of values and education, but do you think it's also fundamentally to do with the theology, and that people just don't buy into resurrection, incarnation, and so forth? And maybe I'm not suggesting it, but is that also just what it's selling? People don't want to buy, so to speak. We have our own problems in Judaism. But and the second thing is, if I was a vicar, would you give me any hope whatsoever, given that there are clearly yearnings for spirituality, as we're seeing in angelology and paganism? But could the church do anything to tap into that, or is it actually sort of the end of the road?
Can the church tap into Islam's success, do you say?
No, can the church do anything to redeem itself?
Oh, can it do anything to redeem itself?
So to speak.
Okay.
And tap into the latent spirituality, or is it just beyond
yes.
it?
Okay. Yes, thank you.
Have a go at that one, Linda.
Okay, these are big questions,
There are
aren't
two
they?
there.
Why did Christianity decline? Yes, I'm suggesting on my mices that actually intellectual failure is more of a problem than people often think it is. It's not that everyone's an intellectual and they want, full coherence in their religion. But if you just haven't got a good answer to, well, how does a creator God, how does evolution work? And do you still believe in resurrection then? resurrection goes together with creation. You create like in the click of a whatever, and then you recreate like that. There isn't really a good Christian answer to problems, real problems, like what's happened to someone when they die. Christians haven't got a good answer anymore. There are lots of those failures that do actually bite, and you lose vitality. Now, I'm partly blaming that on fundamentalism, but not entirely, because that wasn't the place you're expecting to get intellectual vitality. It's more the failure of liberal Christianity and intellectual theology, I suppose, even university-based theology, to provide really credible answers, or at least to the church to interface with that, the church heirs, and listen to that. I mean, quite often, most extremely in the Catholic Church, some of those voices trying to do that work have been just stopped from teaching and silenced. That's a disaster for religion. So intellectually, I think it's a big failure, but also the failure of values. So for churches that are customary churches, institutionalized, the mystery about things like the Church of England is how it lasted so long. It's because it's custom, it's baked into the custom and your major life rituals, and you just do it because it's fine for that. So it's got that general cultural buy-in, even if you're not one of the 1 in 5 devout people. But if you start to then stand for something really ethically wrong, anti-divorce, anti-remarriage, anti-women's equality, anti-gay, there's a long litany of things in the post-war period. Forget sexual abuse. The next generation thinks, I don't want to be associated with that. And besides, intellectually, it doesn't make sense to me. So you lose your kind of cultural capital, I think, quite quickly, and that's what's happening. And can it learn from the kinds of magical spirituality that are growing quickly? It can, but I think it's too late in this country. In the Scandinavian churches, they've been much better at that, because they are more truly democratic, and they have allowed those groups in. If I'm going to make a wild prediction now, I think that there is a crisis looming financially of what we do with all the churches, we as a nation, I mean, particularly the historically important medieval churches and buildings. The only solution to that is going to be if the churches give them up completely and they truly become open to their communities and any practice, including tarot, including humanist weddings, including whatever it is the community wants to do in them. That's going to save them. But that's going to take a long time and a complete collapse for that to happen. So I think they will creep back in. And of course, all those things used to happen in Paris churches. If you look at the old medieval wall paintings and the actual practices, a lot of that was going on. And local healing gods and goddesses and so on. It may come back, but the churches have got to let go completely, I think. I don't think they're going to welcome any of it.
Thank you. This gentleman here. Other questions? There's one there. And Christopher. And yeah, okay, we'll come in a minute.
Sorry, Professor Woodhead, thank you so much for not putting Islam in an alarmist light and seeing it having a positive place in British society. And I'm associated with the Muslim Council of Britain, and we are dreading the right-wing press headlines when the religion figures are announced later next month.
You're dreading it, did you say?
We are dreading it because looking at the experience in the 2011, some of this, there were very, very alarmist headlines. The Muslims are taking over, Sharia is taking over, even though the population was perhaps under 5%. And I suppose now there will be an increase in the Muslim population, as you say. So we are dreading this particular backlash that might happen. But my question is slightly different. Looking at the no religion responses in the census, and if you do a cross-tabulation of ethnicity against the no religion response, it is much higher for the white ethnic category compared to the other ethnic categories. And how would you explain that? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that about your dread about the census results and what that will elicit. There is a lot of panic about the growth of Islam. And it is partly about what I'm talking about. It is about those voices, that becoming the most vital part of religion in this country. That's a very frightening prospect to a lot of people who don't know about Islam. it's ironic, isn't it? Because I think I'm right in saying that the question on religion was put in the census in 2001 because Muslims wanted it there, because it was that second generation struggle to be heard and to be visible and to be counted, literally. Count us, see how many there are. And it has made a big difference. But it's a two-edged sword, like you say. Have you got, I want to ask you a question. Have you got a press strategy? Have you got a counter strategy to what might happen?
But I think an important point has been made is that diversity is the catalyst for creativity. I mean, if you look at what has happened, say, with the COVID vaccine breakthroughs in Germany, that was by a Turkish scientist who had settled there. So that there are good stories to be told, but are there people willing to listen?
It will be interesting to see, won't it? Because there are more prominent Muslims in public life now than when the last census came out. Maybe they'll be good allies. Who knows? It will be interesting. Aliad, have you got any thoughts about this?
Just a very quick comment. I do believe that the threat of a growing Muslim community is greatly exaggerated. There are a lot of identity panics in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, about the reproductive rate of the Muslim community and also the kind of growing cultural influence and the normalization of certain Muslim practices. But I do feel from the outside it's greatly exaggerated, because from the inside, if you access the internal Muslim narratives, the House of Islam is definitely not in order. But particularly from the church's perspective, I think there is a lot of there's a lot of panic about it from in Christian corners.
Mm. And then you also had a question about ethnicity on the census correlating with religion or non-religion. It's really just a sort of function of the fact that Britain is still so predominantly Christian, and that's where the non-religious is clustered. Also Chinese, who also say non-religion on the census. And the levels of religion being higher in the other ethnic groups. On the whole, you'll find that in the places where they are a majority, but of course, being a minority gives you a particular protection, make it important as a protective canopy, if you like, to identify with that group. So I don't think there's anything particularly telling about those figures. It's about the failure of the churches, which where most white British people were.
Thank you. So my name is Matthew Dell, and I'm more experienced in the world of religious education in schools. And I think you're aware of a trend that's been happening over the years with reports like RE for Real and others calling for essentialization of religion to be challenged. And some of them, the point really being a growing sense that religious groups are not to be thought of as a homogeneous unit. So this is what all Muslims think, or this is what all Christians think. And I just wonder, listening to you, whether you've homogenized Christianity and maybe, for instance, talking about, the Anglican Church is a very broad church. Likewise, the Catholic Church has, traditionalists and liberals. So perhaps by homogenizing churches together, that's unhelpful. So that's kind of my point, that perhaps we need to be more sensitive to the diversity within Christianity. That's my point, and a reflection on that would be helpful.
Well, I will try and defend myself, because I think that, I'm not saying, I know from my surveys that most Christians don't follow the line of their leaders. So Christians in this country are just as liberal in their ethics as the general population. The Anglican Church of England, for example, are indistinguishable from the general population in their ethical views on things like euthanasia and divorce and abortion and so on. And Catholics aren't much different from Church of England. They absolutely do not follow what their leaders say. But my headline about fundamentalist capture is about what the people in power, what's been driving them, often what their profile is increasingly, and even if they're reacting against it, what they're reacting against is absolutely dominant. And as I said, the media has picked up that idea as well, that this is real religion. And there's been a failure of the non-fundamentalists to get into the positions of power, to make their voices heard in a credible way, and to keep that profile up so that young people could understand that there is actually a difference.
Are you ready for another question?
Okay,
yeah?
go.
Okay, remember, say who you are and keep it quite short.
Okay, I'm Andrew Brown. I write about this stuff occasionally in collaboration with Linda. I've got two actual questions. One is, I thought when you dismissed the Queen not as a Christian leader, it seems to me that this was wrong. She's not a man in a frock.
Not a Christian leader.
Yeah, you described her as not a Christian leader.
Okay. But I said she was a better Christian leader than the actual Christian leaders.
Yeah, no, that...
Supreme governor of the church. Preached often and well.
But the other point is, I know your argument is a very strong one, that when the churches took up positions that a majority of women especially thought were immoral on sexual matters, they lost credibility. But in America, ECUSA, as far as one can see, went right along with the prevailing cultural changes, and it didn't help it at all. What's the explanation for that?
Okay, the Queen most definitely was a Christian leader. And I think actually there's a very important point here which I didn't talk about, which is that the Christian ethic that she articulated and represented was an ethic of self-sacrificial duty and self-giving love for others. And in losing her, that ethic has lost it's kind of been orphaned, it's lost its anchor, it's lost, and yet people recognized it and celebrated it and gave thanks for it in the grief and the tributes when you read all the labels in Green Park. And who's going to carry it now? Who's going to carry that virtue? Because we still need people, and any society needs people to care for dependents, to do horrible work, to clear up the mess, to do that. And it used to be justified by a Christian ethic in nursing training and so on and so forth. And it's lost that underpinning now. We still do the work, but we don't dignify it in the same way. And where will that come from, I think, is a real big question. I certainly wouldn't for a minute say that making your ethics in line with what people consider common decency at a particular time guarantees success. It's just a basic kind of minimum. Because it's one of my mices, but it's only one. And for a majority religion to offend deeply against people's moral sensibility, that's a very, very serious failure. But it doesn't guarantee success that you don't do that.
Okay, Catherine?
Catherine Peppenster. I found your argument about religion, particularly Christianity, losing cultural capital, a bit of a curate's egg. So good in parts, but I felt there was an aspect to Christianity's place in this country that you left out. When the Grenfell fire happened, one of the local vicars said they heard what happened, they switched on the lights and they opened the doors, and people trusted them. They didn't trust the government, but they trusted them because they were always there. When London shut down because of the deep COVID lockdown, the local churches in the centre of London focused on those who were left behind, who were homeless. They went and lobbied Westminster Council to get them to open the public toilets they'd locked up so that the homeless could go to the loo. At that kind of level, the grassroots level, even if people don't go to church, the churches are still playing a really important role. And I wonder if they will become even more important, and what you think about this, as we face such a huge cost of living crisis. And I also would add into that other faiths too, mosques, etc., temples of other religions. But I think your presentation tonight left that out somewhat.
Well, I don't dispute the fact that churches and mosques and other religious institutions play that very important charitable role. But I think increasingly, I don't think it's got a lot to do with religion. It's a charitable role. So most of the great charities have a religious foundation. They've tried to wipe it out of their branding and their title and their name. It doesn't help them. In Kendal, which I keep studying year after year, the Christians who have formed groups who are doing a lot of this work are very careful now not to identify as a faith-based organisation. And it causes them a lot of problems of legitimacy, both with the statutory authorities and local government and funders, and also to some extent with people they're providing for, because people worry that there's going to be what they call strings attached about proselytization or conversion. It's not true, but they have to overcome that. So that means that they have to downplay the religious label. And some groups that are the most successful groups at this, like the Salvation Army, who are huge providers, the religion has withered away now. It's an enormously big, successful charity. So what you're talking about happens, I don't think it will benefit the growth of Christianity.
I think we're going to take two more. I'm sorry, we're not going to have time for everybody, but one here and then Christopher at the back.
So I'm Barney, I'm a student, and I want to ask about the growth of astrology and spirituality among young people that you mentioned, and that's something that I definitely agree with a bit of kind of first-hand experience. But I want to ask, do you think that these are deeply held beliefs, or is there a link perhaps to what kind of I would say is perhaps the growth of irony among young people, where you have kind of words like kind of energy or kind of reference to I'm a Taurus, I'm a Scorpio. Do they end up just becoming devout of any kind of spiritual meaning and just kind of form part of a general kind of youth cultural lexicon?
Thank you. So the question is whether the kinds of spirituality magic that are growing amongst young people have got really strong roots. I always find it impossible to answer that question because I don't think you can judge the depth of someone's spirituality. I mean, you might if you live with them day in, day out, but as a researcher, you just can't. You can't do it. I don't see any reason in principle why not. And of course, like any religion, there are various degrees of superficial to deeply serious. And I think that's just as possible in the kinds that I'm talking about as others. You've reminded me of an important point, though. The other thing that's happening amongst young people, there is this general cultural, of course, you're completely right, that it's also in the culture, there was Harry Potter, there's lots of cultural things that make it just very, very easy and to be interested in, and it can be edgy and cool, and that can be superficial, of course. Alia can tell us whether the cool Muslim stuff might be superficial. I don't know about that. But as well as that, amongst young people, those who take it very seriously can either do it in a solitary way, and you can't judge if that's deep, or they do it by joining a community. And the other thing that's not growing amongst young people, but important in the religious life of young people, is that those who want to take their traditional religion seriously, whether that be Jewish or Muslim particularly, they want the symbols, they want the rituals, they want the clothing, they want the language that they've got to learn. That is those markers are important. So going back to Alison's opening question, if you make your religion completely invisible, that goes against that. But that trend is stronger in religions that are minority religions, I think. And what I was talking about is growing amongst majority. It's sort of in taking the place of Christianity more.
A final question from him, Christopher.
Yeah, Christopher Lamb. I'll stand up. Just a comment and a question. That the comment is about what you said about the Catholic Church and what's been happening recently. You mentioned John Paul II clamping down on theologians, and you mentioned right at the beginning about Islam and the church. And I think what Pope Francis has done is open up a discussion in the church and has certainly reached out to Muslims and has been really a leader in that. I suppose it's too soon to say sociologically what that might mean. And my question is sort of drawing on from that is Francis has faced a lot of opposition and pushback from those inside the church on the basis that it's high tension faith that will win over the nons and high demand religion. And we see in the Catholic Church this trend towards kind of neo-traditionalism. Shia LaBeouf, the actor who said he's been attracted to Catholicism through the traditional Latin Mass. And I'm wondering to what extent does this high value neo-traditionalism, how much of a phenomenon do you think that is within Christian churches?
It's absolutely a phenomenon, and insofar as they've got some life, that's often very visible. I just don't think it doesn't affect the overall decline. It won't affect the overall decline. It'll probably increase the overall decline. There will always be some people holding on to that, but it hasn't succeeded. And you make a good point about interfaith dialogue. I mean, it's also interesting to look at the things that just didn't succeed. The ecumenical movement didn't work. Interfaith dialogue, what's it produced? I'm not saying it's not important, but did it really intellectually come alive? Can it? Will it? And who initiates it? Kim Knott in this book says that it was Christian guilt. Christian guilt drove interfaith dialogue, and so it would never succeed. It was her prediction. Can it take other forms and come from other voices? She didn't think so, but I hope something like that could happen. And actually, and here I take some responsibility, because as head of a theology and religious studies department down the road, we have students from all religions and none, and it is a very important place, universities always were, for the growth and change and development of religion, and allowing different voices to be heard and challenged and develop and learn from one another. So I do have a bit of a stake in what happens in that sense. And I think some real exchange and dialogue can happen in that context.
Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you all very much. I know this conversation could have gone on a long time, and I know there are some great questions still to come. I'm so sorry we haven't got time for them all. Please help me thank Linda for a really fascinating and challenging lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.